Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie, and this is the Majori on Bowie YouTube channel, where I have a new interview every week that always has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, visit the blog, www.majorionbowie.com, where I have new content every single day that almost always has something to do with David Bowie. And today, I'm really pleased and honored to be joined by Professor Donald Lopez, one of the most distinguished American scholars of Tibetan Buddhism. Professor Lopez is the Arthur E. Link Distinguished University Professor of Buddhism and Tibetan Studies at the University of Michigan. He is author of Buddhism, A Journey Through History, which I just learned has been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in History. And his most recent book is The Buddha, Biography of a Myth. At this point, you might be asking yourself, why is one of the most renowned academic experts on Tibetan Buddhism joining me on a Bowie show? Well, so we could better understand some of what David Bowie was up to. David Bowie showed an interest in Tibetan Buddhism since the late 1960s, and according to some reports, he even considered becoming a monk. He met and claimed to have studied under the displaced Lama, Chime Rinpoche. Bowie wrote and recorded songs that had very explicit references to Buddhism and Buddhist concepts, and sprinkled words or ideas from Buddhism in other songs as well. Beyond that, his entire presentation throughout his career seems to have at least been informed by Buddhist ideas. Before we start, I would like to just make a caveat that we're not here to talk about the personal beliefs of David Robert Jones. That's David Bowie's real name, which I don't pretend to understand or know. We're going to take a look at some of his lyrics and discuss their meaning, as well as how some Buddhist concepts may have informed the way he presented himself. That caveat aside, welcome, Professor Lopez.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So before we get into David Bowie, can you tell us a little bit about the two most recent books that were published in this year, 2025?
Well, the first, they're both from Yale University Press, and the first is a very large 500-plus page history of Buddhism that tries to cover the entire spectrum from the time of the Buddha 2,500 years ago till the present day. And so that's the big book. The smaller book is this biography of the Buddha. I think, there's everybody says that all English professors want to write a novel one day. I think all scholars of Buddhism would like to write a biography of the Buddha. So I'm finally gotten around to that, but one in which I try to sort of confront all the problems around his historicity, all the myths around him, and how much we really know historically about him. So it's I can say it's a much shorter book and probably therefore a bit more accessible, at least in terms of length.
Well, that's fascinating, and I'm tempted to ask you a lot of questions about both, but that will sidetrack us.
Right.
But I'm especially impressed that the book that came out in January has been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. So if you want a better objective marker of excellence and a compelling piece of history, that's it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for joining me. So let's just sort of start with a very high level. What are some of the distinctive qualities of Tibetan Buddhism as opposed to something like Zen or any other school of Buddhism?
Well, Tibetan Buddhism, of course, is the Buddhism of Tibet. It's interestingly, the Buddha probably died around 400 BCE. And despite that, Buddhism then spread all around Asia relatively quickly, but it went to Tibet rather late. It was only about 1,000 years after the death of the Buddha in the 7th century that Buddhism was introduced into Tibet. Then the Tibetans became extremely dedicated to the practice of Buddhism. Many Tibetans then made the dangerous trip from the Himalayas down into India and studied with some of the great masters there. The Tibetan language, it says, at least the written language, was invented in order to translate Buddhist scriptures from Indian languages like Sanskrit into Tibetan. So we have a huge canon of Indian Buddhist works that are preserved in Tibetan. And those texts then became important, especially in Mongolia. in parts of Nepal, and in those areas of the former Soviet Union, Buryatia and Kalmykia, where there are large Mongol populations. So we can say Tibetan Buddhism is the Buddhism of the country of Tibet, but it's also has one of the canons of Buddhism along with the language of Pali and Chinese. And so because it's late, it has a very strong tantric element about that. So tantra is a late development in Buddhism, a rapid path to Buddhahood, things that we don't see so much in China, at least in this particular form. And so that's one of the hallmarks of Tibetan Buddhism is its tantric element. So that's the short answer. Zen is, of course, another very famous form. Zen is a Japanese pronunciation of a Chinese character, which is Chan, and Chan means meditation. So the Chan school came to China or began in China a little bit before Buddhism came to Tibet, probably in the 6th century. Despite the fact that they claim a link back to India, Chan is probably a uniquely Chinese form of Buddhism, which then became very important both in Korea and Japan. And so its scriptures are, of course, in Chinese. The Tibetan scriptures are in Tibetan. And like all forms of Buddhism, they trace their origins back to the Buddha himself, whether those links are historically accurate or not.
Mm. So David Bowie had, at least when he was younger, had a specific interest in Tibetan Buddhism. And there's a very famous figure associated with Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama.
Right.
A little less famous is the Chime Rinpoche. However, I do associate him with some figures from popular culture, and Bowie claimed to have at least studied under him for some time. Who was he? Or who is he? I think he's still alive.
So the Dalai Lama just celebrated his 90th birthday. In 1950, he was 15 years old when Chinese troops entered Tibet. And over the next decade, the political situation deteriorated significantly until there was an uprising in March of 1959. And during that time, the Dalai Lama escaped to India. And he's not returned to Tibet since then. So he was followed in the next couple of years by about 100,000 Tibetans, including many important lamas and monks, mostly coming south into Bhutan or into Nepal or into India. And so that was in 1959, the few years after that. And then slowly, some of those lamas made their way to the West. And so one of these lamas, whose name was Chime Rinpoche, he's an incarnate lama, which is a particular kind of lama that's important in Tibetan Buddhism. It's called a tulku. He arrived in London in 1965. And so he, as a Tibetan Lama being present in London, I think he attracted quite a bit of attention. And we know that we think that Bowie met him in 1969. I've read some interview in which Bowie said that in 1969, I had my 15 minutes of Buddhism. And he talked about its influence, especially on Man Who Sold the World, which we can talk about or not. But so that's who Chime Rinpoche was. He's a high incarnate lama of one of the four major sects of Tibetan Buddhism, escaped from Tibet after the uprising of 59 and made his way eventually to the West and to London.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look at some of what we're talking about. Even before then, Bowie wrote a couple songs that definitely reflected some Buddhist ideas. So one song, not one of his better known songs, is called Silly Boy Blue from 1967. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of lyrics from this song. Yak butter statues that melt in the sun cannot dissolve all the work you've not done. What does that mean?
So in Tibet, they follow a lunar calendar, and they have a very big celebration at the time of the Lunar New Year. And one of the things that they do at that time is to make very beautiful and elaborate statues out of yak butter. These are multicolored. They're almost always of Buddhist themes to bring good luck to the new year. But like everything else, as Buddhism tells us, things are impermanent and they do melt in the sun. And so that's what he's referring to here, is that these yak butter statues do melt in the sun and cannot dissolve all the work you've not done. I think, again, I'm just guessing here, but this is probably some reference to the escape of the Tibetans in 1959. They did a lot of work in Tibet for the sake of the Dharma, for the sake of Buddhism. but there's still more to do. And so I think he's probably talking about, he could be talking about here, Tibetan Buddhism coming to the West, work yet to be done.
Yeah. But before we move on, you mentioned the Dharma. What's that?
The Dharma is just Buddhism. It's another word for Buddhism. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So sticking with this song, Child of Tibet, you're a gift from the sun, reincarnation of one better man. The homeward road is long. You've left your prayers and song.
Yes. So gift from the sun is not a particularly Buddhist image necessarily, but again, we're talking about a lama, a child of Tibet, who generally the previous incarnation is always seen as the greater saint. Of the more so the more famous saint is the earlier incarnation, and then the later ones are somehow also aspire to greatness, but their identity comes from the previous incarnation. So any incarnate lama would be the reincarnation of one better man, I think, according to Tibetan belief. The homeward road that's probably the road back to Tibet. Will the Tibetans be able to return? So the homeward road is long. You've left your prayers and song. And so again, these are the prayers and songs that Tibetans have and have left behind in Tibet, but also bringing with them to the West.
Yeah. Is the Buddhist concept of reincarnation different than the Hindu concept?
It's very similar. The larger issue is whether there is a self or not in Buddhism. I know we'll talk about that at some point in our conversation. But in Hinduism, there is a self or a soul that goes from lifetime to lifetime. In Buddhism, there is not, and still there is reincarnation. So in terms of one rebirth after another, it's fairly similar between the two religions. The question is, what is it that goes from lifetime to lifetime? That's the difference.
Does that process end at some point?
Well, it ends when you achieve nirvana. So nirvana is the end of the path, and where you're no longer reborn. In Tibetan Buddhism, they would say that rebirth ends when you achieve Buddhahood, which is the state of ultimate perfection, a state of immortality as a Buddha. And so it ends, but until that, we are wandering throughout the realms of rebirth. And interestingly, in Buddhism, they say that cycle of rebirth, which is called samsara, a word that just means wandering in Sanskrit, has no beginning. So we've all been reborn from beginningless time. We've all been every form of life over all these lifetimes. And our goal is to end that cycle.
Yeah. Well, we will come back to this because reincarnation seems awfully similar to something related to Bowie. So another song he did in 1967 was called Karma Man, an even more overt title. And here's a line or a lyric from it. Figure sitting cross-legged on the floor. He's clogged and clothed in saffron robes. His beads are all he owns.
So he's probably describing a Buddhist monk here, sitting in the meditative posture, the lotus posture on the floor. I don't know what clogged means here, because anyone sitting in that posture would be barefoot. Clothed in saffron robes is the traditional color of the robes of a Buddhist monk. It's actually the robes of the Tibetan monks are red. So he's talking more about just the famous saffron robes of Buddhist monks there. And his beads are all he owns. So in Tibetan Buddhism, it's very common for a monk or even a layperson to have a rosary from which they recite mantras or prayers. And so his rosary is all he owns. So again, this is either referring to the common Buddhist monk who has no worldly possessions, or again, a Tibetan who has lost everything as he has gone into exile.
Okay, now from the same song, Karma Man, tattooed on your side, the wheel of life. I see my times and who I've been. I only live now, and I don't know why. And we're not going to linger on this screen. We're going to go to the wheel of life. So what is the wheel of life?
The wheel of life, or perhaps the more accurate translation, would be the wheel of existence. So this is the wheel of rebirth. And so what we have is the 6 places of rebirth. There's 6 possible places of rebirth in Buddhism. And that's the wheel that we see here. And it's being held in the claws and fangs of this demon. And this is the Lord of Death. And so we are always in the jaws of death throughout our life. So if we want to start at the top and go in a clockwise direction, at the very top, we see the realm of the gods. So Buddhism does not have a capital G God. It does not have a creator God, but it has many gods. These are beings who have fabulous lives in beautiful heavens. They can be there for a very long time. Because of their good karma, they're reborn there. But like all places of rebirth, they are impermanent. So once you're reborn in heaven, you eventually die there and go someplace else, and you go someplace down. So the God realm is something that many people seek. Many Buddhists seek that through their practices, but it's not seen as a permanent salvation. So there's another strange group that's not talked about sometimes. Sometimes we talk about 5 realms, and those are the demigods, and those are the people that we see to the right going clockwise. You see a tree there. And so the problem for the demigods who have their own powers is that they have a wonderful tree in their land, which bears fruit as various forms of jewels and treasures. But as in the famous dispute between neighbors, the roots of the tree are in one land and the fruit are in another. So the gods get the fabulous fruit of the demigods' trees. The demigods are jealous and they go to war with the gods, and that's what we're seeing there, going to war. After the demigods, we see continuing in the clockwise direction animals. So in Buddhism, we can also be reborn as animals. So you can be a fish, a bird, a deer, a snow leopard, as we see there, a snow lion, a yak, a horse. All forms of animal life are things that we have been in the past. So all of us have been animals and insects in our past lives. And if we have the bad karma to be reborn as an animal again, we can be there again. So that's the next realm. And then directly below the gods are the hell realms. Now, Buddhism has a very elaborate system of hells. 8 hot hells, 8 cold hells, various neighboring hells. And what we see there is the Lord of Hell, covered and circled by flames. And there we see the hot hells with the people being burned and tortured by various demons. And then we see these sort of mountains of snow in the right there. These are the cold hells where there's no light, there's no sun or moon, you're naked, and you just wander through these horrible realms of ice and snow for millions of years. So those are the hells. Then as we continue in the clockwise direction, we see these kind of bloated bellied figures. These are the ghosts, or as we call them often in Buddhism, the hungry ghosts. So another bad rebirth is to be reborn as a ghost. So we have the ghosts there, and then continuing up, we have humans, and we see human realm. So we have a woman giving birth. We see on the left. On the right, we see a man with a kind of a burden on his back. He's carrying a corpse to the place of cremation. And so basically what we have here is the 6 realms of rebirth. There are 3 good ones, to be a god or a demigod or a human. That's the top half. And we have a lower half of the bad places as an animal, ghost, or in hell. And you're reborn there based on your karma. So it's said that by being ethical, you're reborn as a human. By being generous, you're reborn as a god. By being stupid, you're reborn as an animal. By being hateful, you're reborn in hell. And by being greedy, you're reborn as a hungry ghost. So as we go to that then next circle inside, we see how we travel, right? You go from going down and the black side from animal to hungry ghost to hell being. And then we see on the left side in white going from human to demigod to God. We're going around and around in this cycle. We've been doing that from time immemorial. And we're doing that because our mind is polluted by the 3 poisons: desire, hatred, and ignorance. So we have desire in the form of a rooster. We have hatred in the form of a snake, and we have ignorance in the form of a pig. So we're looking from the very center of what motivates and creates this entire realm of rebirth. In the very center, we see the realms then around that, all being held in the jaws of the Lord of Death. And then outside the cycle, in the upper right, we have the Buddha pointing to the moon of enlightenment on the left.
It is, once you're reborn as a hungry ghost, or you're in hell, is it hard to get out?
Well, so basically every one of the hells has a set lifespan. And so you just have to wait it out. It's like a prison sentence from which there is no reprieve. And so all of these, it's generally said that in all of these realms, there's a set lifespan for each of them, and you just live it out. And so that's all kind of predetermined by your own past actions.
But do your actions when you're in that hell determine what you come back as next time?
Not so much. I mean, so it's really said that humans have the most control because we have the power to make decisions in ways that animals do not. So, for
Yeah.
example, an animal which is a carnivore, like a lion, obviously kills other animals, but they don't really suffer the negative consequences of that karmically because that's just what they are. Humans killing animals, that's a negative deed that carries negative karma. And so it really has to do with your state of mind and your intention, the intention that motivates the deeds.
Yeah. One of the things I'm struck with by looking at this and listening to your explanation is that there are parallels or superficial similarities to other religions. I'm thinking about Dante's description of the seven hells, and some similar layers of reality in Greek mythology, and also even going back to David Bowie. He for a while was interested in Kabbalah, and there's a famous image on the back of one of his records of him sketching the tree of life, which I know very little about. Other than that, it similarly is kind of a cosmological map. And why do you think we sort of spiritually like to map things out this way?
Well, I mean, I guess that raises the larger question of the belief in heaven and hell.
Yeah,
And obviously, I think for heaven, we want to be able to imagine a life beyond death, whatever that might be like, and a place where we might be reunited with our families and our loved ones. And there's hell, which is where we hope the people that we don't like go. And so it really is, I think the ideas of heaven and hell in some ways allow us to answer the question of why the wicked seem to prosper and why the good suffer. And if there must be some recompense for that at some point. And so we hope that the good will have their reward in heaven. And I think many people hope that the wicked will have their recompense in hell. And so I think it's really thinking about our future existence and how what we do in this life affects that future, which is unknown to us. And so
yeah,
this particular picture. It's called the Wheel of Life or the Bhava Chakra in Sanskrit. We have a Buddhist text in which the Buddha himself says that this should be painted at the entrance of every monastery, so that when lay people come to visit the monastery, a monk can explain the cycle of rebirth to them. And so this goes back to India, but this particular form, we see it also in China, but it's really most famous in this kind of Tibetan painting.
I'm just going to ask you two last questions about this image. The one is the demon death has a third eye. What's the significance of that? And I asked that in the context of, in 1973, Bowie would paint a third eye on his forehead. What is that?
Well, the third eye is something that occurs often in Indian religions and also in Buddhism, and sometimes it's an eye of wisdom that we see in beneficent deities or Buddha figures, and sometimes we see it in demonic figures like this.
Finally, why
And
is
so,
the circle in the grips of the demon death as opposed to a more benign figure representing life? If we're all constantly dying, we're also constantly being reborn.
we're all being reborn, but just to die again, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
idea is that we've been reborn forever, and the thing that we want to do is to gain immortality, whatever that means. And until that point, we're in the grips of this horrible demon. And in the case of Buddhism, they say something which is indeed factually true, that none of us can say that we will not die in the next moment.
Yeah.
And
I was going to get to this. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
that's a horrifying thought.
Yeah. I was going to get to this later, but I want to just point out that it's hard for me not to think of the process that Bowie repeated over and over again of creating characters, killing them off, and then coming back in a new form, which he did throughout his career. And I'm not saying he was trying to embody this idea, but he also was aware of it. So, when I referenced the idea that he might have been informed by Buddhist concepts, example number one is right here.
Yes, I mean, as you well know, he often talked about himself as the actor. So these were often parts that he played, but there is also this, Thin White Duke, we can go through the entire list of his personae. And that does have a sense of a kind of a rebirth. And those often were followed with very great changes in the musical style as well.
Yeah.
Right.
And we'll even in just a moment, we'll come to a reference to rebirth. But let's move on here. So these lines are from the 1970 song After All, which is on The Man Who Sold the World, which you referenced. And we could talk about the whole album, but just starting with this song in particular. I sing with impertinence, shading impermanent chords with my words. The concept of impermanence is central to Buddhism. Why? What does it mean? What's the significance of these lines?
It means that, so he's referencing, as you say, impermanence, which is a term exactly as you note, is very much associated with Buddhist philosophy. Buddhism says that everything about us, everything about our world is disintegrating at every moment. We have something called coarse impermanence, rough impermanence. That's the impermanence that we know when you break your leg or break a teacup or the various things that happen every day when things change. We know those. But we lack the wisdom to see that things are falling apart in every single second. They're in a constant stage of disintegration. And so they talk about things in Buddhism everything has the famous three marks: impermanence, suffering, and no self. So impermanence is the first of those. And so it comes up again and again in Buddhism, really talking about the fact that we have a future which is outside our control. And that's something horrifying. That we are subject to change at any moment, but depending on our karma, that change can be good or bad, but it's often bad. And so impermanence, the lack of anything to hold on to that lasts more than one instant, is a very important Buddhist insight. And that's what he's referring to here. Shading permanent chords with my words. Yeah.
I'm struck that by another set of lyrics that I don't have to show, but it's from a much later song called The Wedding, which he wrote for his own wedding to Aman. And he released it on the 1993 album Black Tie White Noise. It's not one of his better known songs, but he has this line, "She's not mine forever, angel for life." And what strikes me as remarkable is that most love songs have this air of endless love or eternal love. But here he's showing a recognition that even his marriage that he's just entering into is not permanent. So he wants to make the most of it while he can.
Yeah, and we see that. So this is 1970, and then his marriage is how many decades later? So again, I think that's a nice sort of suggestion of his sort of the Buddhism in the background. Yeah.
Yeah. So one other line from this song. There it is. Live till your rebirth and do what you will. So we just talked about the concept. Do you want to add anything?
I don't think so. I mean, he's basically saying that, of course, typically we would say in a standard song, live until you die.
Yeah.
But here he's saying, live until you die and then are reborn. And until that point, do whatever you want. That would not be a Buddhist teaching. You want to use the rarity of the human birth to do everything you can to have a better rebirth and ideally to escape the cycle entirely. So human rebirth is seen as something extremely precious in Buddhism and rare.
Yeah. Now, before we recorded this interview, we chatted a little bit to get a sense of what this show was going to be about. And I mentioned an idea that you thought probably did not reflect a Buddhist idea. And I was conflating the concept of nothing with the Buddhist concept of emptiness. And I just, you're not supposed to read all of these lines, but the word nothing appears over and over and over again in Bowie songs. But we were telling me before we started recording that there is a distinction between nothing and emptiness. What is that distinction?
So emptiness is one of the most profound and difficult concepts in all of Buddhist philosophy. So I'll just try to give a brief explanation here. So nothingness just means that there's nothing there. It's a complete vacuum. Emptiness means lacking some specific quality. And so in Buddhism, our great ignorance, the deepest ignorance is our belief in self, our belief that within us is a self or a soul that lasts forever, that goes from lifetime to lifetime. This in Buddhism is the great mistake, because if we believe in a self or a soul, then we engage, indeed motivated by hatred to protect that self or soul, and motivated by desire in order to soothe or inflame that soul out of greed. So all of these things produce a negative karma that then cause us to be reborn in those three negative realms that we just saw, as an animal, as a ghost, or in hell. And so the insight of the Buddha is that there is no self, that within us, there is nothing that lasts longer than a second, that we are simply a process of physical and mental elements in constant flux. And our error is that within that, there is something that lasts more than a second, something we would call a self. There is no self, and so we are empty of that self. So this is the idea in Buddhism of selflessness. Selflessness doesn't mean, as we usually say in English, that you're a person who is generous. It means that there is literally no self within us. And then as Buddhist philosophy developed, we see this selflessness or lack of self evolve into the idea of emptiness, which is that not only are we devoid of that kind of self, but nothing, none of the objects of our experience has any kind of essence. We think about in Heidegger, the thingness of the thing that makes something really what it is, that essence. It's the belief in that essence that is our problem. It's that essence that makes us want to hold on to some things and to discard others. And so that our greed for possession is because we want to possess that thing, but that thing is just something that it just falls apart in our hands. Everything is impermanent. Everything is empty of that kind of self or soul. Everything is, so they would say in Buddhism that everything is dependent, nothing is independent. So when we talk about dependence in Buddhism, they talk about three kinds of dependence. An effect depends on its causes, of course. There can be no effect without a cause. A whole, a W-H-O-L-E, a whole, depends on its parts. When we take a thing apart, then that whole disappears. And especially they say that everything depends on the consciousness perceiving it. So they're saying that our own mind projects this essence onto the object of our experience and gives them a kind of reality that they do not possess ultimately. And that's our fundamental ignorance. So that's the emptiness. Doesn't mean nothingness. It doesn't mean that nothing is there. It just means that everything is empty of that kind of essence or soul.
So, what is the thing that gets reincarnated then?
Well, that's a huge question, right? So this is something that Buddhists must face. That is, how is rebirth possible without a soul or a self?
Yeah.
And the answer that is given is that we can imagine a candle that is lit, that has a flame, and a second candle which is unlit, and we can light the second candle from the first. That is, the flame of the first candle can pass to the second, but that flame is not a thing. That flame is simply a process of oxidation. And so this process, this continuum, we are not nothing. We are a series of moments. That series of moments can move just as it moves from a minute ago when we were talking to this moment. Then that consciousness can move from one physical body to another. They talk about ourselves as a continuum of mind and body. Our body ends at death, but the mind continues and it finds a new place of rebirth. We'll talk about this in a moment when we talk about the Bardo. But that's how they explain rebirth. They want to say that rebirth is possible without the self or soul that is talked about, for example, in Hinduism.
Yeah. So I don't mean to stretch a metaphor beyond its usefulness, but again, it's hard for me not to think about how it's hard to find an essence of David Bowie, right? So I mentioned we're not going to talk about David Robert Jones. David Bowie is a character who would then appear in characters. So to get to the center of Ziggy Stardust or the Thin White Duke, or even the sort of avuncular, happy David Bowie from about 25 years ago, you get to another character, and at essence, what's there?
I think for the fan, I think that's an insightful point. I mean, you wonder about people who knew him well, his family and friends that he knew his entire life. Did they see him changing in that way or not? Would be something to think about. But certainly, I think for those of us who know him through his music only, I think that's one way to think about his career. Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you teased it. Before we get to the song that mentions the Bardo, is there anything else you wanted to say on The Man Who Sold the World?
No, I mean, I know he did say that the album was influenced by his short time as a Buddhist.
Yeah,
It's not one. I mean, for me, I think for many Americans, really, we first came to know Bowie through Ziggy in the summer of '72, and then maybe went to Hunky Dory after that. I had a friend in college who had Hunky Dory. I remember I saw it in his dorm room, but I never listened to it. I only got to that after Ziggy. And then, as you know, after the success, especially of Ziggy, then both Space Oddity and Man Who Sold the World were reissued, and those came after that. So Man Who Sold the World was an album I really appreciated a lot, just for the kind of the heavy sound, which was
yeah,
different from everything else. But nothing lyrically really struck me as that Buddhist at the time, and I frankly haven't gone back to sort of look at those lyrics again to see if there's something I missed.
yeah. So let's go on to Hunky Dory and the song Quicksand. And so I'm going to tell you something that I'm somewhat embarrassed by. For years, I thought that this was some kind of reference to Bridget Bardot.
Yeah, right.
I
Without the
did not
T,
know what the
yeah.
word meant.
Yeah.
If I don't explain what you ought to know, you could tell me all about it on the next Bardo. So what is a Bardo?
So in Buddhism, there are two schools of thought about what happens when we die. According to one school of thought, we are reborn someplace in the next instant. And that could be, again, in any of the six realms that we've spoken about. But according to another school of thought, which is the one that's followed in Tibet, there is something called the intermediate state between death and rebirth. And that's what the Bardo is. It literally means in Tibetan, between two. And so the idea is that after we die, we wander in this thing called the Bardo, looking for a new place of rebirth. And we can wander in that Bardo for a period lasting from 1 second to 49 days. That is, there can be up to 7 different Bardos that last for 7 days. At the end of the 7th, you're going to have to find some place. And so you're really looking, ideally, and this is talked about a lot in Tibetan Buddhism, the Bardo is also a place to achieve enlightenment. And so if you can understand the visions that you see there, you can become a Buddha in the Bardo. But for those of us who are overcome and frightened by the various images that we see there, we have to keep wandering the Bardo until we find a next place of rebirth, until we enter another womb. And so the Bardo then is this kind of place of literally between two realms, right? It's a place of mystery. It's a place of opportunity. And the most famous of all Tibetan works, at least in the West, is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. That Tibetan Book of the Dead, that title is something that was just made up by the editor, Walter Evans Wentz, because he was interested in the Egyptian Book of the Dead as a theosophist. So that's not the title in Tibetan. The title is Liberation in the Bardo Through Hearing, the Bardo Tudril. So what this means is as a person is dying, and even once they are, from our perspective, already dead, a lama will be called in to read to them or from this text so they can hear instructions about how to find liberation in the Bardo. So that's what Bowie's talked about here, right? So if I don't explain what you want to know, if you don't find out what you need to know in this lifetime, you can tell me all about it on the next Bardo, next time I see you in this next intermediate state. So this is this place between worlds, and therefore it's a place of great opportunity and danger. right? And so the Bardo is a very important concept in Tibetan Buddhism. And this was probably the most famous reference to that in any rock song in history.
Well, I have to say, Tibetan Book of the Dead is a much cooler title. So it's
Well, I mean, I would disagree with you because
that's okay.
obviously I think the Buddhist title is much more inspiring. Yeah, right.
Well, Bowie appears to have actually known what it was about. So
He did know exactly.
yeah. So those are the last specific lyrics I wanted to ask you about. And I'm just going to ask you about a couple of other concepts, and then I'm going to close with asking you a silly question. So David Bowie, throughout his whole catalog of more than 400 songs, has very few happy songs. Many of them are dark, either lyrically, thematically, or they sound dark. Does this reflect a concept of suffering that is connected to Buddhism, and what is the significance of suffering in Buddhism?
Well, so Buddhism has the famous Four Noble Truths, right? And the first truth is suffering. And in his first teaching after his enlightenment, the Buddha talked about the Four Noble Truths, and he said that humans have 8 forms of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, and death is suffering. We also suffer when we lose friends. We suffer when we make enemies. We suffer when we don't get what we want. And we suffer when we get what we don't want. This is when I teach this in my Intro to Buddhism class, I always make the point that we think about religious insights as being culturally specific. That this is something that was said in India 2,500 years ago in an ancient language that is lost by this figure who's so mysterious, the Buddha. And yet no one can disagree with that list of 8. And this is a universal truth about the human condition. So Bowie, I think, knew his Four Noble Truths well. And I think he found that it was actually more profound to write about suffering, right? Everything from life on Mars to stay.
Yeah. Through several of the songs on Black Star.
Oh, and Black Star, of course, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
once we get toward the end, I mean, it becomes more pronounced, but the fact that it's already there on Hunky Dory, I think, is quite significant, yeah.
The related question I want to ask is, he seldom offers solutions in his songs. Many of his songs point out problems, societal problems, problems of the human condition, personal problems. He seldom points out solutions or prescriptions of what should be done or what should happen. You know, I talking to you, I know so little about Buddhism. I'm going to ask about a phrase that I've encountered, which is nirvana is beyond concepts. And am I correct to link this phrase with the idea that it's sort of pointless to sketch out how things should be or what a solution is to these unsolvable puzzles?
Well, I mean, so again, we have to come back to these Four Noble Truths because that was just the first one, suffering. So the second one is that there's an origin to suffering. So the Buddha was able to identify that this suffering comes from desire and hatred and ignorance. It comes from these things called the 3 poisons, which are based really on this belief of self that we talked about. So if you stop there, then he's basically Freud, right? Just basically diagnosing the human condition in very precise terms. But then he said that there is a state beyond suffering, which he calls cessation, the third truth. And cessation is nirvana. There is a state in which suffering no longer exists. And then we have the fourth truth, which is the path. And so the Buddha taught the path to nirvana. And so he did teach the path to escape from this cycle of birth and death. So there's always hope, of course. If he stopped at cessation, if he stopped at suffering and its origin, then, you know, what is there to do except be depressed? And yet he offered this solution. And so it's interesting when we look at the Four Noble Truths, we have suffering, origin, cessation path, which is a strange, it's an effect and a cause, followed by an effect and a cause. But they say that really the Buddha is like a doctor. So the first thing the Buddha that a doctor does is to see the symptom, right?
Yeah.
That's suffering. And then he gives a diagnosis. That's the origin of the sickness. And then
Yeah.
he makes a prognosis. Is this a fatal disease, or is there a subsequent state of health, right? So that's cessation. And then he offers the cure. That's the path. Right?
Yeah.
So that's why the four truths are in that order.
That's fascinating. So this isn't the silly question, but you say that in giving that response, it makes me remember the name of your most recent book, Biography of a Myth, the Buddha Biography of a Myth. What was the Buddha a historic? Is there a historic Buddha?
Well, that's what I take up in the book, and it really is, and I'm not being coy. I think it's just a very difficult question. The more that we know about ancient India, and we know more about the origin of the texts that are ascribed to him, it's more and more difficult to find that historical figure. We don't even have a good idea of exactly when he lived and died. And so the book is one of the things I do. I tell the story of the Buddha in some detail, and then I turn then to this question of his historicity and look at all the problems that we face when we try to sort of pin down exactly who this person was and when he lived, and especially what he taught.
Yeah. Well, makes me want to read your book.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, Professor Lopez, thank you so much. I have one closing question that I ask everybody who comes on the show, which is, what's your favorite Bowie song and what's your favorite Bowie album?
Well, so as I said, I started with Ziggy, and then went backwards. And I think I was really staying very closely with him through, say, Let's Dance. And then I kind of lost interest for a while and came back with Outside, and then stayed with him till the end. So as I was thinking about our conversation today and which albums I tend to go back to, so I still listen a lot to Hunky Dory. I listen to Diamond Dogs. That's a favorite. Station to Station. And then, of course, Scary Monsters, and then Outside. Probably those. I mean, Ziggy, those lyrics are so deeply ingrained in the gray matter of my brain. I don't need to listen to it anymore because I know it so well. I can hear it in my head. But those 5 albums, I still go back to this many years later. If I had to choose one, oh boy, I guess I probably would say Station to Station.
Station to Station.
Yeah.
Great album.
Yeah.
What about a song?
Um,
It's okay if it changes tomorrow.
I don't know, maybe Stay.
Stay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great song. Yeah. Well, Professor Lopez, thank you so much. It's really an honor to have you on the show, and fascinating conversation. I really now want to read your book. So, I mean, your most recent one. So,
Okay, thanks.
I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you for coming on, and please let's stay in touch.
Absolutely, and thanks for having this series. It's a great gift to all Bowie fans.
Thank you. I'm back with Professor Lopez. We were talking after we wrapped up the interview that you just watched, and we were talking about how perhaps suffering is not the final word on David Bowie, and nor is it the final word on Buddhism. Professor Lopez, why don't you share what we were just talking about? What occurred to you after we wrapped?
Well, I think we ended by agreeing that Bowie had a particular sensitivity about human suffering and its various qualities and its types. And in addition to that, he had a genius for expressing and describing that suffering in both musically and lyrically. I think, however, that he had a response to suffering that we see in a number of songs. And one particular song occurred to me, which is, of course, the 1981 Under Pressure.
Yeah.
Look at that as a Queen song, and it was released on their album. But in later interviews and what we know about the recording of the song, David Bowie wrote all the lyrics himself. And he recorded the song and performed it many times in concert. And in those films of those concerts that survive, we see that this is not simply Bowie the actor. As he sings that song, it's Bowie the human being. And he feels these lyrics, I think, very profoundly. And so I think
So
yeah.
this is not a song that I immediately associate with Buddhism or Buddhist themes, but you gravitated right towards it. Why is that? How is there a Buddhist interpretation of Under Pressure?
I think there is. I think it's really talking about recognizing human suffering and then responding to that suffering with love. So maybe we can just go through some lyrics and I can sort of give kind of a Buddhist commentary on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as the song says, it's terror of knowing what this world is about, watching some good friends screaming, "Let me out."
Yeah.
So in Buddhism, we live in the cycle of rebirth and the cycle of suffering. All six realms have particular sufferings, and the actual Buddhist response should be to want to escape, to let me out of suffering. How can I do that? That's the thought that we should all have. The question is how to do so. What is the response to the suffering of others? Turned away from it all like a blind man, sat on a fence, but it don't work. That is, we turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. This is not going to help them. It's not going to help us. He goes on to say, keep coming up with love, but it's so slashed and torn. Love is in some ways such a cliche, right? It's all torn up by all of its usage and misuse over in so many different contexts. But then it goes on to say, why not love? Love, love, love. And that's a very powerful moment in the song itself.
You know, there's something unusual in terms of David Bowie lyrics in that compared to, not that I've done lyrical analysis of many other pop stars, but I think the word love, it appears far less frequently in Bowie lyrics than you would imagine. But here he's repeating it over and over again, kind of like a mantra almost.
Exactly. It's like a mantra. And in of course, the famous duet with Annie Lennox, she's the one singing this line.
Yeah.
When he does it with Gail Dorsey, she's singing this line. And then he says, insanity laughs under pressure, we're cracking. So in Buddhism, I remember once we talked before about this idea of self and how in Buddhism, the belief in self is the cause of all suffering. And I remember once a Tibetan Lama saying that, of course, we have to use the pronoun I because we talk to each other. I did this, you did that. It's just a way of using conversation. But the Lama said that if you're in a room by yourself and if you have the thought I, that's a sign of insanity because you're really believing in that self, and which is the fundamental form of ignorance in Buddhism and the fundamental source of suffering. So this insanity laughs under pressure. We're cracking this belief in self and this caring about ourselves above others. This is what causes us to crack. The song then goes to why can't we give love one more chance? So taking this love, which is such a cliche that's been slashed and burned, let's try it one more time, because he goes on to say, for love is an old-fashioned word, and love dares you to care for the people on the edge of the night. Love in Buddhism, of course, we talk about what love means forever. There's 1,000, 1,000,000 songs about love. It has so many different meanings, but love in Buddhism has a specific meaning. Love is the wish that others be happy. And this becomes...
You know, I was going to ask a question that reveals my ignorance. I think of Buddhism as being averse to attachment, and I think of love as being a type of attachment, but you just made a distinction there.
Exactly right. So love in the form of lust, that's the one that we all know so well, but Buddhism then takes it in a different way, and love is the wish that others be happy. And this is then evolves into compassion. Compassion is a hugely important concept in Buddhism, especially in the so-called Mahayana Buddhism, the great vehicle Buddhism practiced in Tibet. So for example, the Dalai Lama is said to be the embodiment of compassion. He often says, compassion is my religion. And so compassion also has its own definition. Compassion is the wish that others be free from suffering. And so love and compassion then are fundamental virtues in Buddhism, but then it takes it to another step. And instead of just saying, may others be free from suffering, one goes to the step of saying, I will free others from suffering. I will free everyone in the universe from suffering. This is the love, this is the love and compassion that dares you to care for the people on the edge of the night. All of us are at the edge of the night. Love dares you to change our way of caring about ourselves. So here we have a fascinating idea in Buddhism in that the way that you achieve your own happiness, the way that you bring about your own freedom from suffering, the way you achieve enlightenment for yourself is by caring about others. It's by freeing others from suffering. It's putting them before you. It's that compassion that puts them ahead of you, and that brings about your own salvation. This comes through in this amazing Buddhist idea that because we've all been reborn bazillion times in the past, we've all been in every relationship with every other being in the universe. So every being in the universe, every insect, every being in hell, every animal has been our lover, has been our murderer, is someone that we have loved, we have murdered. They've stolen from us, we've stolen from them, we've saved their life, they've saved our lives. And they come down to the fact that every single being in the universe has been our human mother in a past life.
Yeah, wow.
And
Do you, when you look at these lyrics or when you listen to this song, do you suspect that you're not just bringing an interpretation to the lyrics, but do you think that he was aware of the thinking that you're articulating right now?
I think he would have known that. This is
Yeah.
a fairly standard Buddhist doctrine, especially in Tibet. So I think from his studies early in years before, he would have known this. And this line about love dares you to change our way of caring about ourselves. That is, you bring about your own welfare by first bringing about the welfare of others, caring about others. And then this is our last dance. This is they praise human births. Human birth is so rare in Buddhism. We're mostly in hell, or we're some animal, or we're some ghost. To be a human with access to the Buddhist teachings happens very, very rarely. And so if we don't take advantage of it now, we're going to be doomed in many lifetimes ahead. So this is our last dance. This is our last chance, really. This is ourselves under pressure.
Well, Professor Lopez, when I was looking forward to speaking with you, I was thinking I would learn about Buddhism. I was not actually expecting to learn about David Bowie. I thought I thought I'd have the advantage in that part of the conversation, but this is amazing. This is to use a deliberately provocative word, enlightening.
Well, again, I'm just guessing, but the
Yeah.
resonance is very clear to me. So I hope I'm right.
Yeah. Well, it's also a better way to end than suffering.
Exactly right.
So, Professor Donald Lopez, thank you so much.
It's my
Let,
pleasure.
please let's stay in touch.
Definitely.